Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our session on unconscious bias. Before we go into the detail of the session, just a few things to get us started. So some introductions. My name, for anyone who doesn't know me, is Kate Bananis, and I am one of the HR consultants at Narrow Quay HR. And I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague Sarah Martin. And Helen Couchman, who is another of my colleagues from Narrow Quay, is going to be handling the Q&A and will look after questions as they come in through the session, but also will allow some time at the end to deal with any questions. We're going to be talking to you about unconscious bias today. We're also going to put you into some breakout rooms to look at some exercises. I'll run through shortly what we're going to cover, but before I do that, I just wanted to mention some sessions we've got coming up. So we run quarterly HR clubs at Narrow Quay HR, which some of you may have come along to. Those sessions are free sessions, which at the moment are being held remotely. So some dates for your diary if you're interested in coming along to those. The next one is on the 10th of June and is on managing mental health. We've then got on the 9th of September a session on developing your people strategy within your organisation. And the last one of the year is on the 18th of November and is on tackling absence. So the invites for those will be sent out nearer the time, and they'll also be on the Narrow Quay and BWB websites if you're interested in coming on to those. Emma, could you move me on to the next slide, please? So what we're going to be covering today. We're going to look at the legal context for unconscious bias. We're going to briefly touch on some of the science behind the idea of unconscious bias, think about some different types of biases, and in particular, look at how our unconscious biases can impact the workplace. And then finally, give you some tools on how we can tackle our unconscious biases. And as I said, we're going to be using some practical exercises to help you think about those things. So, Emma, if you could move me on to the next slide. Before we launch into the detail of the session, I thought it'd be useful to think about why it's important, why are we thinking about unconscious bias? And unconscious bias is a term that we've heard quite a lot in recent months. And in particular, perhaps around the time of Black Lives Matters last summer, it was in the media quite a bit. You might remember Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, who committed to undertaking some unconscious bias training after being criticised for comments that he made in a radio interview after the Black Lives Matters movement has come to the fore. And certainly movements such as Black Lives Matter raised issues for both individuals and organisations across the UK and worldwide about race discrimination. There's been a recent government report into racial equality, which has been quite controversial and has provoked responses highlighting the experiences of some individuals focusing on ongoing racial inequality within the UK. For example, the number of young black men who get stopped and searched by the police when you compare that to young white men, and the alarming rates of black women who die in childbirth are two of the issues which have cropped up recently in the news. The abduction and murder of Sarah Everard in recent months obviously raised awareness of sexual harassment within society, and many people shared experiences following that of their own personal experiences of sexual harassment, both within the workplace and outside. And most recently, and I know there are lots of delegates here from schools who will be aware of this, we've seen the rise of awareness of a movement called Everyone's Invited, and that movement is raising the issue of sexual abuse within schools and universities and has had a lot of publicity in recent weeks. So unconscious bias is relevant to all of those issues, and employers can have a really critical role in this, with the power to change, to challenge, to empower the workforce and to speak out against discrimination. And many employers will have been doing lots of work in this area anyway, but will be reviewing what they do and thinking whether they could do anything better or do anything more effectively. I think it's also important to note that unconscious bias training has had some criticism in recent months. In particular, the government report on racial equality, which came out recently, itself criticised unconscious bias training, saying that there should be a move away from it. And you may also have seen the remarks of the KPMG chairman on unconscious bias, which were reported a few weeks ago, where he dismissed the idea as well. And I think our view on that is that it's important to see unconscious bias training as one thing that you can do amongst many. It's certainly not a quick fix, and providing unconscious bias training to your staff is not going to eradicate discrimination within your workforce. It is not something that should be regarded as a tick box exercise, but it does have a part to play, I think, in tackling discrimination within the workforce, and it certainly can be really helpful in raising awareness and prompting some reflection amongst individuals and also as an organisation about how you do things and whether there are things that you could do differently. Emma, could you move me on to the next slide, please? So we've just got some quick polling questions for you to get you to just think about the context, I suppose, in which we're working in. So you should be able to vote. So can you vote, please, in terms of the question? So percentage of women on FTSE 100 boards currently. Do you think this is 21%, 36% or 45%? Okay, so that's interesting. 77% of you think that it is currently 21%. In fact, the answer is a bit more optimistic than that. So it is 36% currently, and it's up from 32% in 2019. So a slightly more positive picture. If we move on to the next question, please. So again, you can vote on this one, and this is: how many female chairs of FTSE 350 companies do you think there are? 11, 39, 46 or 98%? Okay, and 51% of you got the right answer there. So there are 39 currently chairs of FTSE 350 companies. So a bit of a way to go, I think, on that one before we see perhaps a bit more equality. And then the final polling question is: how many FTSE 100 companies have a board member from an ethnic minority group? 52, 74 or 82? And let's see what the results are on that one. So 92% think it is 52. In fact, the answer is 74. So that has gone up from 52 in January 2020. So I thought that was quite a positive result when I read about that one. Can we move on, please, to the next slide? So let's start thinking about unconscious bias, and in particular, let's think about the legal context for it. Now, we could do a whole session on the Equality Act and the types of discrimination, but what we will do is just give you a very brief overview. So the Equality Act sets out a number of protected characteristics, which are things that are protected in law, and they're set out on the slide for you. We are probably most familiar with age, disability, pregnancy, race and sex, as those are ones that we come across most often within the workplace, but there is that longer list as set out there. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Emma. So what does that mean? What's unlawful under the Equality Act? Well, there are a number of different types of discrimination, and I've set those out on the slide for you, and I'll run through these briefly. Some of them you'll be very familiar with, others perhaps slightly less so. So direct discrimination is treating someone less favourably because of a protected characteristic. So, for example, choosing to overlook somebody for promotion because they're of childbearing age. So direct discrimination on the basis of sex. Indirect discrimination is applying what appears to be a neutral policy or practice, but in fact it's one that places a particular group at a disadvantage, and that can't be justified. So for an example, A requirement to work past 6 o'clock in a particular job might place women at a disadvantage because they're more likely to need to carry out childcare. Discrimination arising from disability, an example of that would be a salesperson not promoted because of a lengthy period of disability-related sickness absence. So it's the absence, and that's related to the disability. Failing to make reasonable adjustments is something that most people will be familiar with within the workplace. That only applies to disability, and that is the adjustments that you may be able to make to enable someone with a disability to be able to do the job more effectively, and therefore remove the discrimination potentially. Harassment is unwanted conduct relating to a particular characteristic. So, for example, abusive remarks or conduct related to sex or race. And then finally, victimisation is being treated less favourably because you've raised, for example, a grievance around sex discrimination. So that is a very short overview of the different types of discrimination. And we'll talk later about the interaction between the legal protections that are afforded by the Equality Act and unconscious bias, which can in fact be wider than those protected characteristics. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Emma? So to get us thinking about what unconscious bias is, I'm going to give you a scenario. Now, if any of you have ever done any unconscious bias training before, you may well be familiar with this scenario. And I have to say it probably works best in an in-person session where everybody can have a chat about what they think the answer is, but we can't quite do that today. So the scenario is this: a father and son are in a car accident. The father is killed outright and the son is very badly injured. The son is rushed to hospital and prepped for surgery. When the surgeon looks down at the boy, the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son. What's happening here?" And certainly when I first heard that scenario, and when we use this in sessions, you can see that what happens is there is some thought process that is going on. And Sarah and I, certainly when we first heard this, went through exactly that process of trying to unpick what's happening here. So the surgeon is saying, looking down at the boy, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." And for some of us, that's quite difficult to compute when you first hear that scenario. And in fact, the answer is very, very simple, and people come up with all sorts of very complicated answers to try to get around that. But the simple answer is the surgeon is a woman. And for most people, I'd say in the sessions that we do, most people don't get to that conclusion quickly. And the reason for that is because of our unconscious biases. Because for most of us, what springs to mind when we think of a surgeon is a man. And so we have to consciously reach that conclusion by thinking it through. So that, I suppose, just shows how deep-rooted our unconscious biases are. These are snap judgments which we make day in, day out without giving them any conscious thought whatsoever. Could I move on to the next slide, please, Emma? So what is it when we're talking about unconscious bias? So there's a couple of short definitions on the slide there. So social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. And implicit people preferences formed by our socialization, our experiences, and by our exposures to others' views about other groups of people. The ACAS definition is also quite useful. So ACAS says everyone has unconscious biases. The brain receives information all the time from our own experiences and what we read, hear, or see in the media and from others. The brain uses shortcuts to speed up decision making, and unconscious bias is a byproduct. There are times when this sort of quick decision making is useful, for example, if faced with a dangerous situation. However, it is not a good way to make decisions when dealing with recruiting or promoting staff, for example. So the key points I think we can take from this is that unconscious bias is natural, it's unintended, but it can affect decisions, and critically, it can be mitigated. Regardless of how fair-minded we believe ourselves to be, most people have some degree of unconscious bias. You might also hear the term implicit bias used. So implicit bias refers to the idea of having biases, but questions the level to which these are unconscious. And the idea is that once we become aware of our biases, they become implicit. And at that point, we have to take some level of responsibility for them and take steps to try to mitigate their effect on our behaviours. Emma, could you move me on, please? Somebody who's done some interesting work in this area is a psychologist called Daniel Kahneman, and he's written a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he suggests that our mental processes can be seen as operating on two different levels, so system 1 and system 2. System 1 is fast, it's automatic, it requires little or no effort or control, and it's often what's described as a gut reaction or an emotional response. System 2 is slow, it's effortful, and it's conscious. And what he says is that bias is developed over a lifetime of being exposed to more data than our conscious brain can manage. So the unconscious brain, he says, processes 200,000 times more information than the conscious brain. Information is linked together by creating patterns and pathways, and each time this happens, that becomes stronger. So system 1 presents a plausible story, which is only questioned when system 2 is called into play. And what we know is that we process certain characteristics, particularly those relating to age, gender, ethnicity, and disability, before we even know that we've done it. And what we then do is we link that person to what we supposedly know about that group and the category and all the stereotypes that we think we understand about that from our unconscious brain. So that could be described as perhaps favouring those who share our characteristics. So, for example, someone who lives in the same area as town as you do, somebody who wears a brand of clothing that you also like, you might immediately feel more drawn to that person and you might favour them over some other people who perhaps you're interviewing that day for no conscious decision. That is simply something that's going on in your unconscious mind. Emma, can you move me on, please? So how does that link with discrimination in terms of what I was talking about earlier on? Is showing an unconscious bias also discrimination, and what can the consequences of that be? So as we discussed earlier, unconscious bias can be discriminatory under the Equality Act if it's on the grounds of one of those protected characteristics set out on the list. But you can also have unconscious biases related to a much wider range of characteristics which do not sit within the Equality Act and are not protected. So, for example, around people who come from a certain area, have a particular accent, have a particular job working full-time or part-time. It could be all sorts of things. You could also, of course, have conduct which is prohibited under the Equality Act, but is an unconscious bias. So, for example, overt racism or overt sexism. What we need to remember is that unconscious bias can be a factor in some forms of discrimination, and therefore can be a factor where there is some unlawful conduct, and we need to be aware of that. You could move me on to the next slide, please, Emma. I won't read through this, but we will send the slides out after this session. But this is a really helpful way, I think, of just seeing how a judge in the Supreme Court has referred to that sort of unconscious bias and how it has had an impact in terms of the case and how that's been managed. So it's useful to just have a read through that. Emma, could you move me on now, please, to the clip we want to show you. Now, I think the way we're going to do this is that Emma has put the link to this in the chat box. So can you just take a moment to go into the chat box and click on the link, watch that clip. I'll do the same so I know the timing, and then we'll come back and I'll chat about it. Brilliant. So I hope everybody's had a chance to watch that clip. If that didn't work for any reason, we can share that in our follow-up. It's a really interesting clip, isn't it? And every time I watch it, I think it's just worth sharing that with people, because although it's nothing that we would perhaps be surprised at, it is just remembering that those children, their reaction is total shock when those people are women, to the point that one of them says they must be dressed up. This can't be real. And so I just think that shows really clearly what it is we're dealing with here. It's nothing conscious, it's just those messages that they're getting from being absolutely tiny. And so, yeah, it's useful to see that. Just very briefly, one of the things that we shared with you in advance is a link to the implicit association test, which has been developed by Harvard University. You may have come across it before. I won't talk about it in any detail, but it is really interesting. If you haven't had time to do it beforehand, then have a go at doing some of these tests. There's lots of different ones that you can choose to do. They don't take very long. And the idea is that they measure your biases. And of course, I think we all go into them thinking we won't come out being biased, and all of us find that we are in one way or another, which is actually very refreshing, because I think the message is everybody has got biases. They may be different, but everybody shares them. There are, Emma, sorry, if you could move me on to the next slide. There are some criticisms of this particular test. I think it should be seen as an educational tool. It is not a diagnostic tool. It is not universally accepted as being entirely valid. You need to be quite cautious about it if you were going to rely on it in any way. I think it's more something that can be done out of interest. There is some evidence that you can get better at it. If you keep going with the test, you can change your scores. And there's also some evidence that you can fake it, and that particularly people would be keen to do that if they thought their results were going to be shared with others, which in itself is quite interesting. And obviously what it doesn't do is measure behaviour in actual real life situations. So a little bit of caution, but it's quite interesting to have a go. And again, we can share those links again if that's something that people are interested in having a look at. And I'm just going to now pass over to Sarah.
Caitlin, could I interrupt with a question,
Yes.
if that's okay?
Yeah.
I've just got a question here about how much leniency do you think you should give for a conduct where the explanation is perhaps, I didn't realise it was an unconscious bias. So, for example, if there's a personality clash where you don't get on particularly well with an individual for some reason, and you omit them from an invitation to a social event, for example.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? So, and I think we do need to bear in mind that those unconscious biases might well be at play in the workplace in different ways, some more serious than others, I'm sure. And I suppose you could take that into account, but the key thing I think would be how you manage that as an employer, in terms of making sure that you follow a fair process. If the individual who feels that they have been discriminated against in some way, for example, making sure that you follow the fair process in relation to that. And you may well take into account what the other individual says in terms of motivation for that conduct, which might affect the sanction that you were to give. But I think it's really important for you to understand as an organisation what your risks might be in terms of that possible discrimination and the possible impact in terms of something being unlawful, and what that person who has been potentially discriminated against could do with that. So I do think you could take it into account, but as an organisation, it would be about following the right procedures. And I would always probably take some advice in that kind of situation.
Thank you.
So what are our biases? Caitlin's touched on this, and I'm going to explore it in a little bit more detail. So our biases can include all of those in the Equality Act that we've mentioned. So things like race, sex, disability. But our unconscious biases can be a lot wider than this and can include all sorts of different things. Clothing, piercings, tattoos, where someone lives, what car they drive, their friends, and their social background. And I mentioned tattoos because ACAS did some research on this and found that employers had concerns about employing people with visible tattoos, citing concerns about the professionalism of that person and the perceptions of clients and customers. And the research found that young people would be especially impacted by this, because the statistics are that 1 in 3 young people has a tattoo. So that's a good example of our unconscious and sometimes conscious biases at play. And thinking about how this then develops into stereotypes. what our brain does is link the person in front of us to all the supposed knowledge of the category we have built up over a lifetime of social learning and experiences, and that then creates what we know as a stereotype. And those are then perpetuated again by what we see and hear around us. It's a sort of mental shortcut, really. For example, when most people hear the sentence, "My friend is an airline pilot," the image that their mind, for most people, will conjure up is that of a man in uniform. That sentence is unclear as to whether to what the gender of the friend is, but the mind tends to want a clear understanding of the situation. And the way it will do that is by a tendency to smooth over uncertainties, using stereotypes and unconscious bias. But I think what we can see is that stereotypes are quite rigid and they're quite an oversimplified image of a social group. So whilst they help our brains to operate more efficiently, given the huge influx of information that's thrown at us on a daily basis, the problem is that they are not based on rationality and logic. So just because one might have mostly seen male pilots, it doesn't follow logically that all pilots must be male. And it doesn't follow also that all pilots should be male, or that men are intrinsically better pilots than women. And what I think is interesting is that somebody doesn't have to enforce a stereotype to be impacted by it. Example, some research showed that female academics in science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine were just as likely to discriminate against female candidates in employment as their male colleagues, which I thought was interesting. Moving on from the sort of different characteristics that might elicit our biases, there are some different types of bias, and I wanted to explore some of these in this part. Probably the one that you are most likely to have come across is this idea of affinity bias, otherwise sort of known as in-groups and out-groups. And this is where we tend to favour people or warm to people who are like us. That could be in terms of their appearance, their beliefs, or their background. Maybe they're a similar age to us. Maybe we share a similar accent to them. Which suggests that we grew up in the same area. It makes us feel more comfortable to that individual, that we share a sort of common ground. What it can do, though, on the flip side, is it could lead us to feel less favourably towards those who we don't feel an affinity bias to. I think that's really one to really watch out for in your sort of day-to-day interactions with people, really kind of noticing where your feelings towards somebody might be being affected by affinity bias. Then there's confirmation bias. And this is where we only notice things which confirm what we already know. And so the evidence then supports our viewpoints. The idea that we believe what we want to believe. We can see this around us in lots of areas. Perhaps one example that I thought of was climate change. There are some people out there that just simply don't believe that climate change is a real thing, and will look to evidence that supports that viewpoint and sort of ignore the rest of it that doesn't confirm that belief. And the final one is social comparison bias. And this is the idea that people can base their mood or their feelings towards somebody who they feel is physically or mentally better than them. And that can provoke feelings of dislike towards that individual. If we move on to the next slide. So what I want to move on to now is okay. Well, we've thought about characteristics that might elicit our biases. we've thought about how biases contribute to social stereotypes, and we've looked at the different types of biases. What we're going to think about now is how those biases can have an effect, particularly looking at the workplace. And how we can look at that is thinking about two different ways, both those sort of micro and macro situations. So the micro is really about those sort of very small, subtle, seemingly meaningless things that collectively can be quite significant. So it might be the way people interact during meetings. Certain people get heard more than others, for example. Is there one person who doesn't get invited out to that social event, or doesn't seem to be greeted by their head of department in the morning, who's never asked about their evening or weekend plans? Those micro events may seem like nothing, but added up and over time, they can be really significant. There's a psychologist called Pete Jones who looks at these micro inequities and thinks they're really serious. He thinks they're evidence of unconscious biases surfacing at work that over time can lead to that person being overlooked in a bigger way for key pieces of work or for promotion. Then you've got your macro situations, which is the sort of much more obvious, bigger, more visible, high-stakes inequalities. And those are things like a recruitment decision, for example. With this in mind, we're going to move on to think about our first exercise. And what I'd like you to do, please, is we're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms, and Emma's going to sort that out in a moment. We'd like a spokesperson from each of the groups to be ready to give some examples of the things they've been discussing if they can. And it would be a good idea, if you can, to just take a quick screenshot of the information from this exercise, because you'll be able to see it in your breakout room. So what we'd like you to do is think about situations in your daily working life where unconscious bias might affect decision making. We'd like you to think about what situations that might crop up in, what unconscious biases might come into play. And in doing that, we'd like you to think about the characteristics covered by the Equality Act. And we'd like you to think about the different types of bias. So, for example, things like affinity bias. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to do that exercise. It's about 10:13, so we're going to come back at 10:18. Let's move on to sort of have a quick chat about this exercise. So the question was, the first question is really thinking about situations in your daily working life where unconscious bias might affect decision making. Can I ask somebody from one of the groups to give me an example?
I'm happy to go from our group if you'd like.
Thank you.
We talked about recruitment and recruiting different types of people, kind of cultural fit type things, and also where you receive complaints or you have to deal with disciplinaries with students. You could have confirmation bias or affinity bias, where you've already prejudged them based on what they've done or how they look or their behaviour. So, and then you make the evidence fit the outcome that you're looking for.
Yeah.
That was a couple of examples that we had.
Yeah, really good. Did anyone else come up with anything different, or do people come up with other people come up with similar things?
Right, I don't mind speaking. I can't remember which group number I was. Am I coming up on screen or anything? I don't know. Can't see.
Yeah, I can see you.
Right, yeah, so in our group we had Gaminda. Now, actually, it's not her Gaminda's work, it's actually her brother who runs a burger van. So nearly most of the customers come up to, and the first question they ask is your meat halal? Well, Gaminda's family is not actually Muslim, they're Sikh. So they actually just unconsciously bias goes towards Muslim rather than Sikh. That was one there. This is one actually from years ago, I always remember it, where I've spent my time in manufacturing. And I think we were doing dignity at work coursing. Probably can't remember what we called it 15 years ago, probably slightly different. But the engineering manager said, I don't need to go to that because I only have men in my team. So in other words, he was one of the first ones that was forced to go. So it's just something he picked up from there. That's sort of common seen in the past, etc. So that's about as far as we got, because we are very limited on time.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, I understand. It's one of those things that once you start talking about it, you sort of realise that there are loads of examples. Did anyone else come up with anything else?
Group 5, we established that all 4 of us worked in education in some shape or form, and we were talking about application forms as part of the recruitment process, and how obviously it would be ideal to strip back application forms to reduce the opportunity for unconscious bias on the screening. However, we have a juxtaposition in education, because we also have to follow safer recruitment principles, where we actually have to ask candidates to tell us where they've been for their whole histories, and to basically account for any gaps in their application forms. So as HR managers, one of the group was saying, obviously, we are used to this kind of training and this kind of language and this kind of thing. However, once you give the application forms to your line managers, they spend half the time trying to work out, age and, where people have been to school, and basically trying to fill back in the bits that you might have taken out. So it is tricky. That's probably about as far as we got stuck on that, really. So.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, isn't it? Okay, so did anybody start thinking about the sorts of things you mentioned a couple? So filling in the gaps about where that person went to school, trying to kind of gauge what that person's age is. And that's really good, because that's one of those would be protected by the Equality Act, age being a protected characteristic. One of those where somebody went to school, of course, isn't, but it falls into that sort of wider category. Did any of the other groups get as far as thinking about the sorts of wider characteristics or Equality Act characteristics that they thought might come into play or have experienced coming into play?
I'm happy to chip in here. We had a bit of a chat from a school classroom example, where they might have the horns and halo effect. So all the boys are seen as being bad and all the girls are seen as being good. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, I think we'll move on, because I'm conscious of time and we've got another exercise we'd like you to get stuck into in a moment, but loads of really interesting thoughts coming out of that exercise. And in this part of the section, if we can move on, Emma, we're going to think a little bit about the impact, and we're going to look at it in sort of two different scenarios, types of sort of scenarios, really, as I think we can all see that it can impact on various stages of the employment life cycle where there is decision making. Recruitment decisions are an obvious area, as there's lots of scope for this decision to be impacted by bias, and in particular, I think, affinity bias. And I think perhaps one of the best examples of this is some of the studies that have been carried out in respect of job applicants who have names that suggest they're from a minority ethnic background, when he or she has exactly the same qualifications and experiences as candidates that don't have that background. The evidence has been that they are overlooked for the role because of their name. Now, that can, of course, be overt racism rather than unconscious bias, but I think we can certainly see how unconscious bias plays a role there. Other examples that are listed up there: promotion, how decisions are made in respect of grievance and disciplinary decisions is another one. And somebody mentioned that in their feedback about how you might look to the evidence to sort of prove a particular point of view because of unconscious bias. Another bit is around just the sort of day-to-day allocation of tasks and how that's done. For example, does the high profile work go to our go-to people, or do we sort of need to take that 10-second pause sometimes to sort of think about why we're doing that, think about what our thought process are, and think about allocating to others. So I think it's really about analysing what the sort of impact points are in your organisation, and thinking where those decisions might come into play and might impact. Because as I was saying, they might feel like sort of small things, like micro things, but over time they can build up and have bigger impacts. And I suppose thinking about how you might address those things, raising awareness is absolutely key. Training like this is really helpful with that. But the other aspect is around designing processes and policies in a way that helps to mitigate unconscious bias coming into play. So absolutely, recruitment processes is a key one. And somebody in a schools context was talking about managers then going to try and fill in the gaps that as HR professionals you might take out to try and reduce the impact of bias. But an easy win is to try to make sure that or do the best you can to anonymise those application forms and remove those sort of unnecessary details that might lead to decisions being impacted by bias.
Sarah, can I cut in with a question just regarding policies?
Yes.
Just thinking about what's your thoughts on creating a policy that could potentially be perceived to be based on stereotypes? So thinking the example of a dress code policy, where you might request someone who not to show a tattoo when they're client facing, for example, or no visible piercings, for example. What should be people's thoughts on being a bit careful around that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I remember this coming up a year or so ago in a case where somebody was asked, who was on reception, that she should always wear high heels as part of a sort of image thing, rather than flat shoes. I think the basic position is that you've got to be guided by what the job requires. And, if it's a health and safety issue, to have, visible jewelry, hanging down and potentially getting embroiled in machinery or whatever, then that of course will justify your decision. But I think really it's about thinking about why are we doing this? What's our rationale? And do we think that actually this is being influenced by things that really are not really relevant and don't have really a place in our workplace? So I think a lot of it's about kind of just going back over your decisions and the policies that you've got in place and being a bit critical about them as to how they've come into play and whether they're still relevant and should remain as they are.
I think the other thing to think about is, are we missing having some really brilliant people working for us who might be put off by some of these policies that perhaps we haven't really reviewed for a long time, or we haven't really had that critical thinking that Sarah's mentioned? Could we be actually missing out on some really brilliant talent because people aren't attracted to working with us or are put off by some of our policies, and to just maybe widen our thinking a little bit?
Thanks.
Yeah, if we can move on to the next slide, we're going to think about some of that sort of broader and perhaps kind of less broad and less direct and obvious impacts. And the first one on there is exactly as Caitlin has said, really question whether the operation of bias, whether it be in a sort of dress code policy or the operation of affinity bias in a recruitment process, is stopping you from getting the most talented people in your organisation. So, thinking about and being critical of those processes, and what are the touch points? Where are those areas where there's room for biases to impact on recruitment decisions? And I'm not going to say too much about that because our second exercise is going to look at recruitment in a bit more detail. The second sort of thing is around, whether by some of the decisions an organisation is making, you are stopping people from reaching their full potential. Because, for example, you might not be giving that high profile piece of work to the young mum who you think might struggle to do it because of childcare. You know, over time, as we were saying, that might lead to that individual not really being able to be the best they can be and drive your organisation forward in a way that's really positive. The next is around diverse thinking, and if you're recruiting people that are sort of in your own image or a sort of a similar group, so affinity bias I'm thinking about here, it could mean that you're not getting a really broad range of views on things. It's not fostering really good creativity and innovation. An organisation that's got a really diverse range of employees is really well placed to understand the needs of a really broad client base, and it also puts you in a good position to recruit and retain staff from a wider, broader social base. And I suppose the last part of this is thinking about the wider role that your organisation should play in terms of equality and diversity. So representing a cross-section of society and playing a role in trying to move society forwards in terms of those unrepresented groups. Can we move on to the next slide? So as we sort of talked about at the beginning, we are all biased to a degree. We're all affected by this. And so we want to sort of think a little bit now about our toolkit, how we might start to reduce and manage the operation of our unconscious biases. So this is the idea that we can both individually and collectively take steps to reduce our level of bias, but we need to accept that we're all biased to different degrees. We know it happens from an early age, it's natural, it's unintended, and we need to think about our responsibility to sort of try and reduce and mitigate its impact. So those strategies might involve typically mitigating the effects of the processing mechanism in our brain and thinking about how we might design policies to mitigate the impact of that bias. The important thing to recognise, of course, is that it's unconscious. So it shouldn't be seen as something to beat yourself up about. We receive information all the time from our own experiences, what we read, we hear, what we see in the media, and from others. And those biases are shortcuts designed to speed up our decision making. The vast majority of the population would, I am sure, not go out of their way to intentionally be sexist or racist. But the point is, we might be carrying around certain biases that impact on how we behave and our decision making without even realising that we're doing it. Raising awareness is a key part of that. And in a way, that's the point of the training today. We need to understand that it isn't a question of getting rid of unconscious bias, but instead about managing it. There's a difference between an emotional reaction and how we then choose to act. Can we move on to the next slide? So the first part of that really is resisting this idea of, well, if it's unconscious, then I can't help it. That is going to be a key part of addressing unconscious bias. And below are some sort of strategies really that you can start to employ both individually and across your organisations. The first is thinking about challenging some of those commonly held stereotypes. I suppose the first part of that is thinking about how you could do some analysis of what those stereotypes might be. So, for example, you could look across data on senior positions held by age or gender and see what that tells you. Some of you today, I know, are here from schools, and we could have a much wider discussion, I'm sure, on the impacts on learning and how stereotypes impact on gender divides in education. And thinking about how we might then start to challenge those stereotypes is really interesting. And it can be something as small as the imagery that's used to accompany job adverts, to how we select people to perform a certain task. The second strategy is sort of starting to challenge assumptions about situation. This is about sort of taking a step back. We might assume if someone's late for an interview, we might assume that person's lazy, they're a bit disorganized, perhaps they're not committed to the role. You can see how very quickly confirmation bias might come into play. Oh, you know, they were slow in responding to that question. Well, that reinforces my belief they aren't really committed to the role. You know, challenge that in yourself. You know, ask them about the journey. It might be that they left in plenty of time, the exact same amount of time you would, but encountered something totally unforeseeable on the way. And suddenly stumbling over a question could be perceived as them really giving some thought about their response. The third strategy is about changing our perception and relationships with out-group members. Now that's going to be something that's highly personal and is going to depend on who we think our out-group is. So perhaps an easier place to start is thinking about, well, who's in my in-group, and work from there. And that might be initiating conversations at conferences or social events. And then very slowly, I think we can see how that might start the process of changing perceptions. Could we move on to the next slide, please? But I think what we all need to accept is that, you know, this is not necessarily an easy and quick thing to do, which is why some of the critical sort of responses to unconscious bias training might be saying, well, yeah, we've done the training, but we're not seeing any tangible changes across our organization. You know, I think it's one of those things that it's going to take time, and it's not necessarily a sort of, you know, I've had the training, now it's sorted kind of thing. But absolutely having an awareness of it is definitely part of the strategy for trying to alleviate the impact of it. And one idea, for example, is to introduce nudges in your organization. So rather than simply thinking, well, everyone's had this training and let's leave it at that, you know, try to create and build into your culture an encouragement of colleagues to nudge others when making sort of key decisions on promotions, for example, to be that critical friend, to be saying, well, hang on a minute, what's your evidence behind this? Can you justify your decision? It's about having somebody else to sort of have that moment to make you pause and reflect. And the second part is to think about how we might use our internal policies and processes to help mitigate the impact. And, you know, we've mentioned anonymizing CVs as being a really quick win. So we're going to move into think about exercise 2 now, if you can move on to the next slide. So thinking about interview situations, because we've talked about how recruitment can be a key one. In your groups, we'd like you to discuss what advice you might give to somebody conducting an interview to reduce the risk of implicit unconscious bias. Conscious of time, we're going to give you 5 minutes to talk about this. So we'd like you to come back at 10:46. Emma will pop you back into your breakout rooms, and we will discuss your thoughts. So, who would like to kick us off? What sorts of things did you come up with? Anybody from the groups happy to come up?
Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I think someone else is going to. So I don't mind going. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, good. Okay. So we were group 1. We were just talking about maybe having a conversation up front, or maybe doing some training prior to the interview process to sort of talk about the importance of avoiding bias and to be aware of bias and what to be aware of. But we were also talking about things like having very specific questions and making sure we look at the questions prior to the interview process to make sure there was no potential bias in any of the questions. Making sure that we have a sort of anonymised application form so that we can't make any preconceived decisions making prior to the interview process. We were talking about sticking to the questions as well, the importance of sticking to the questions and not deviating too much from them, because we've all been in interviews where that's happened and then you get inconsistent interview processes.
Yeah, I think that's all really good stuff. Like you say, sticking to the questions and not listening to what the scores or however you've rated it, listening to what they tell you, rather than sort of then allowing yourself, even with all that evidence in front of you, to sort of go with your gut or say stick to what the scores tell you. Did anyone else have any other ideas?
May I speak on behalf of Group 6, please?
Of course.
Sorry, I can't use my camera because of the internet in our house. It came up, the topic of dyslexia and actually how you fashion the interview and things like tests and the timing of tests. And in fact, you could be screening someone out from the very beginning just by assuming that you are all the same. So to think carefully about how your interview is structured and the whole application process, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's such fertile ground for bias to come into play and affect the outcome in a really kind of real way. And I think you're right. And that's something that would hopefully or could hopefully be picked up in terms of adjusting or adapting those sorts of tests prior to the candidate undertaking them, so that any of that disadvantage caused by their dyslexia could potentially be removed, and you would then hope that they would then be treated the same way as every other candidate who was being considered that day. Did anyone else from any other groups come up with anything? I think you've got
we touched on all of the things that have just been discussed. The one thing additional to that we said is that the interviewing panel should score each candidate at the end of that interview and not wait till the end of the whole process, because then you're actually creating a hierarchy of candidates and basing your scores on who you thought was the best rather than the outcome of that actual interview. And we touched on, with regard to disability, the fact that a lot of people make a decision not to disclose a disability at the application stage. And then when it is disclosed at the interview stage, it's about managing the interview panel and the manager's awareness of that, and that they're not being disregarded on the basis that they need an adjustment right from the offset, that a manager's not thinking, gosh, if I need to make these changes just for the interview to take place, what am I going to have to do with regard to them getting the job and actually starting work.
Yeah, because actually, that is it falls squarely within the realms of being something that's potentially discriminatory and then risky for an organisation. So it's really important that that's got right. I think that's an important point you make about when you score. I also think there's a point about the panel members not discussing their views on a candidate before all the individual panel members go off and do their scoring of the candidate, because it's planting those seeds that may come from a place that's not entirely reasonable and fair. So if one of the panel members says something about a candidate that could be seen as sort of stemming from unconscious bias, then that itself can then start to have an influence on how others regard that person. I think time of the day is a really sort of practical one to take into account. And that's because, this is quite hard. It's quite mentally, we're taking a step back and working through some of these things that we've been just doing naturally for years. And so when we get tired, when we get kind of worn down at the end of a day, you can sort of slip into those sorts of kind of old habits. So I think, try and organise interviews for a time of day where you're going to have more kind of brain space and energy to sort of analyse your thinking a little bit more. So that's all really good stuff. We want to leave a couple of minutes for questions at the end, if we can. So if it's okay, I'm just going to move on to the very last slide before we move on to questions. And this is thinking about this idea of the active bystander. So this sort of flows on from the training today and moves on to think about, okay, well, we've got this awareness, we sort of understand the concepts. How can we start to think about putting it into practice in terms of what we see and hear around us, particularly in those sort of micro situations where we perhaps witness some of those things coming to the fore. For example, that person who's always sort of interrupted in meetings, they're the youngest member of the team. Perhaps their voice isn't as heard as some of the sort of older members of that team. How do we deal with that? So the idea of an active bystander is somebody who perhaps takes steps that can make a difference to try and change the workplace. But there are lots of ways you can do that. So, and one of the things is around considering the impact of intervening and considering how you might do it. So one way is sort of using humour to deflect from a situation and make it lighthearted. And, oh, that's funny that you know just did that, trying to make a sort of joke of something that comes up. The other way is to pause, to wait, and then perhaps take something up with somebody after an interaction or after a meeting, where you can sort of say, you know, I noticed this at a meeting or during this interaction, and I just sort of wondered if we could sort of have a chat about that. And these are things that are going to vary considerably from person to person about what somebody feels comfortable in doing or saying, but it is another way that we can start to ingrain the sort of thinking and behaviours in a sort of practical way within our organisations to try and bring some of this stuff to life and make it kind of real in terms of where we see it happening and how we kind of start to address it and try to reduce the impact and hopefully start to create more inclusive and diverse workplaces. So we're just about 5-2. I'm going to hand over to Helen, who may have some questions for us that have gathered through the session.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple of things. Someone has just sort of clarified on the chat that the comment raised about the dyslexia example was sort of a question of neurodiversity, and just explaining that actually people with different brain types have strengths and advantages that might actually be being disregarded by sort of having those biases through an application stage. So I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
A question that was sort of came up at the beginning, actually, when Caitlin was talking about protected characteristics, was what duty is there on employers to actively identify the need for reasonable adjustments if the employee has not self-identified their needs?
I think it's a really good question, and as I'm sure you can appreciate, we could do a whole session around disability discrimination and reasonable adjustments, and each case you need to look at each case individually, and often employees won't come forward with a handy sort of set of reasonable adjustments that they think would help a situation in the workplace. And what we would always suggest is that it's a real process of sitting and communicating with the employee and trying to work out what the problem areas are, what are the barriers, what do you think as an employer you could offer that might be able to help with those areas, but also what do they think as an employee, having had that discussion, might help. And then it's about working through those and thinking whether you think they are reasonable, because they do need to be reasonable. It's not a case that anything that an employee suggests has got to be accepted as an adjustment. So it's really about that communication process. And it's also about potentially getting some expert advice. So you can go off to occupational health and ask for their opinions about what might be a reasonable adjustment that might help. There are some really good sources of advice and people who may come up with things that you and the employee haven't even thought of.
Great, thank you. And someone just wanted, obviously, because we had the sort of sound glitch, Sarah, at the beginning of your session, could you just sort of recap on the definition of confirmation bias, please?
Yeah, of course. So confirmation bias is the idea that once we've sort of formed a view on something, we will only really hear evidence that confirms that belief. So in the example I was talking about of an interview, of somebody being late, and you form a view based on that about somebody, and then everything that you sort of then look for evidence to support that viewpoint. So for example, the stumbling over the question, the not having a very good answer, will all point to your already belief that you've already formed that person, do you know what, I just don't think they're very committed to the role. So it's that idea that we only really look for evidence that confirms the belief we already hold.